The morning light washed over the ranch, spilling warmth across the open fields and catching on the gentle ripples of the creek that wound its way through the land. Birds perched on the fence posts, cattle grazed lazily, and the air carried that crisp, earthy smell that only early mornings in the countryside could offer. It had been years since I first took over this land, slowly expanding it from a modest family plot into a thriving ranch. Every fence post, every irrigation line, every pasture rotation was planned and built by my hands. It wasn't just a piece of property, it was a piece of me. That sense of peace made the bright orange survey flags stick out like a wound. They were small at first, fluttering near the southern fence line, but their meaning was anything but harmless. I thought maybe the county was doing some road maintenance nearby, so I didn't pay too much attention. That changed when I noticed a white pickup truck parked near the old windmill road, followed by more vehicles, men in hard hats, and an excavator rumbling in behind them. They moved around with confidence, planting markers and measuring like they owned the place. I walked over to confront them, boots crunching against the dry grass. One of the men barely looked up as I approached. When I asked what they were doing on my property, he shrugged and said, "Just laying a water pipeline." He said it as if my land didn't matter at all. My jaw tightened as I realized these weren't government workers. They were hired by the HOA from that shiny new subdivision down the road. They didn't ask permission. They didn't even warn me. The calm of my land was about to be shattered, and I could feel it deep in my bones. 2 mornings later, the quiet of the ranch was shattered by the low growl of engines. From my porch, I watched a convoy of trucks roll up to the southern pasture, like they owned the place. Bulldozers, backhoes, and work crews in reflective vests were already unloading sections of thick PVC pipe. This wasn't a small survey anymore. It was a full-scale operation. They were trenching through the field, right across my grazing land, with no hesitation. I stormed toward the site, my boots kicking up dust, anger building with each step. When I demanded to see their authorization, the foreman, a man with a clipboard and an overconfident smirk, flashed a piece of paper at me. It wasn't a county permit. It wasn't even a proper legal easement. It was a document issued by the HOA board itself, declaring the right to install a community water line across unused land. My land wasn't unused. It was fenced, worked, maintained, and mine. They were trespassing. The foreman seemed to enjoy the confrontation, brushing me off like I was an inconvenience rather than the owner of the property. I followed the trench as they worked, watching their machines chew through the soil. They were laying the pipeline toward the creek, the very same creek that my cattle relied on for water. It was a straight shot to their new neighborhood, a bold, calculated move that assumed I'd stay quiet. The HOA had gambled on the idea that I wouldn't have the money or energy to fight them. They probably thought they could wrap the project up before I even got a lawyer involved. Standing there, listening to the heavy machinery crush my pasture, I realized exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a takeover. The very next day, I drove straight into town, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than I cared to admit. At the county office, the clerk behind the counter gave me that sympathetic look people give when they know trouble's ahead. I slid the HOA's so-called permit across the desk and demanded answers. She typed into her computer, frowning as the screen reflected in her glasses. Then she sighed and said the words I dreaded. "They filed an easement claim months ago." My jaw clenched. No one had ever contacted me. No letter. No notice. Nothing. When I met with a lawyer that afternoon, he confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA had used a loophole, claiming the land by the southern creek was unclaimed access, due to an outdated property map. In reality, the fence line had never been updated in the county records, and they'd taken advantage of it. It was a dirty trick, but not illegal. At least not at first glance. Stopping them would take weeks of filing, hearings, and motions. Meanwhile, their pipeline was getting closer to completion with every hour that passed. The HOA wasn't acting alone either. They had a well-connected board with a sharp legal team, and enough money to drag the fight out until I gave up. They hid behind the excuse that the pipeline was for the public good, serving hundreds of homes. They framed me as the greedy landowner trying to deny people their water. The county's hands were tied without a formal court order. As I left the office, frustration boiled inside me. They weren't just building through my property, they were burying me in paperwork and red tape. But as angry as I was, something else began to form beneath that frustration: resolve. They thought they'd cornered me. They hadn't. For the next several weeks, I watched helplessly as the trench carved deeper into my land. What had once been a quiet pasture had turned into a construction zone. The roar of bulldozers replaced the morning birdsong, and the clanking of pipe sections echoed across the fields. They moved with speed and confidence, as if they knew no one would stop them. The day they installed the last section of pipe, I stood by the fence line, jaw tight, fists clenched. They threw themselves a little ribbon-cutting ceremony, complete with balloons, photos, and smug handshakes. The HOA board members gathered around the foreman, congratulating each other like they'd just accomplished something noble. It wasn't noble, it was theft in plain sight. They didn't stop there. Within a week, the flow of water from the creek dropped noticeably. My cattle troughs ran lower, and the irrigation system I had carefully built struggled to keep up. They were siphoning water directly out of the creek, my creek, as if I were just a footnote in their plan. I filed complaints, but the HOA's lawyers responded faster than any agency could act. It was clear they thought they had me pinned. I tried to keep my head straight, but every dry trough and every stretch of withering pasture pushed me closer to the edge. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about respect. They didn't ask. They didn't negotiate. They just took. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I walked down to the southern fence and stared at the pipeline markers running beneath the soil. That's when the anger sharpened into something cold and focused. If they wanted to play dirty, I could play smarter. I wasn't going to stop them at the fence. I was going to hit them at the source. I spent the next few nights at my kitchen table with maps spread out in front of me, tracing the creek's winding path with the tip of my finger. I knew where the water entered my land, but I'd never bothered to follow it further upstream. It ran north, up into the foothills, snaking through properties I'd only ever driven past. I needed to know where it began, because whoever controlled the source controlled everything. After a week of quiet research and a few careful conversations with old ranchers in town, I found it. A natural spring nestled on a piece of land owned by an elderly man named Walter. Walter had run cattle there for decades, but age had worn him down. His kids had moved away, and the property had become too much to manage. He was ready to sell. He didn't seem particularly attached to the land anymore, just tired. When I drove up to meet him, he greeted me on the porch with a weathered handshake and a story about the spring. How it had never run dry, even in drought years. To the HOA, it was just a water source. To Walter, it had been a quiet friend. Over steaming mugs of coffee we talked business. No lawyers. No drawn-out negotiations. Just a fair offer and mutual respect. By the end of the conversation, Walter nodded, a faint smile on his face. The deed was drafted within the week. Just like that, I owned the one thing the HOA pipeline couldn't function without. As I walked along the spring for the first time as its owner, I felt something shift inside me. They thought they'd trapped me on my own land, but they had built their lifeline without protecting its beginning. Now I held the valve to everything they'd stolen. Once the deed to the spring was officially in my hands, I didn't rush into anything. Power isn't about striking fast, it's about striking smart. The HOA had no clue I'd made my move. Their pipeline hummed quietly beneath my pasture, pumping water into their subdivision like nothing had changed. But everything had. I spent the first week walking the property upstream, studying the layout of the spring and every valve, line, and control mechanism. The old structure Walter had built years ago was simple but effective. A concrete basin, a master valve, and a few auxiliary lines that fed into the creek. I could shut it off with a single turn of a wrench. But I wasn't going to act without knowing exactly how dependent they were. I started observing them. Early mornings, their sprinklers flicked on in synchronized rows. Lawns in that subdivision were unnaturally green, the kind that drinks gallons of water every day. Backyard fountains gurgled. Pools shimmered blue. They weren't just using the water, they were wasting it. I even installed a small flow meter downstream to measure exactly how much they were pulling. The numbers were staggering. I sat with my lawyer again, just to make sure I had everything airtight. He flipped through the papers, then looked up at me with a grin. They didn't see this coming, he said. You own the source. You can legally control the flow. No heatings. No months of court battles. Just property rights, clean and simple. At night, I'd stand near the spring and listen to the water rushing beneath the stars. It felt different now. Not just a creek, but leverage. They had built their entire water system on the assumption that it would never stop flowing. They forgot one critical detail. They didn't own it. I did. The morning I decided to act was quiet and cool, the kind of morning that carried a sharp stillness. I walked up the narrow trail to the spring with a wrench in hand, the grass still damp with dew. The sun was just starting to push over the ridgeline, casting gold across the basin. For months, the HOA had treated my land like it was theirs. That ended now. I reached the concrete housing that Walter had built decades ago, the same one that now belonged to me. The master valve sat there, sturdy and simple, humming softly as water flowed down toward their precious subdivision. With a slow, steady motion, I turned it. The handle groaned, the sound echoing through the trees. The flow sputtered, slowed, and finally stopped altogether. Downstream, the creek kept running for a short while, whatever water was left in the line, but within the hour, their pipeline would run dry. I wiped the sweat from my palms, not out of nerves, but satisfaction. By mid-morning, the calls started, first from the HOA office, then from their maintenance contractor, and finally from their president herself. Her voice on the line was frantic, laced with the kind of entitlement only someone who'd never been told no could carry. You can't do this, she barked. I kept my voice calm. I can. And I just did. You should have asked before trespassing. By afternoon, I could already imagine the chaos. Sprinklers would hiss uselessly, pools would stop filling, and all those neatly kept lawns would begin to dry out. They had gambled on my silence, on my surrender. But they had never imagined I'd take away the one thing they depended on most. And as that last trickle of water disappeared into the earth, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: control. It didn't take long for the panic to set in. By the second day, the HOA community looked nothing like the picture-perfect suburb it had been. Lawns that once shimmered green were turning brown under the sun. Sprinkler systems hissed air, fountains stood silent, and the swimming pools began to dip lower and lower. Residents, used to their endless supply of water, started flooding the HOA office with complaints. Why isn't the water working? When will it come back? I paid dues for this. The same people who once ignored my protests were now furious. Not at me, but at their own board. Local contractors tried to flush the lines, thinking it was a mechanical failure. But the truth hit them quickly. Their precious pipeline wasn't broken. It was dry. The HOA president called me again, this time with a voice that had lost its confidence. She demanded that I restore the flow immediately, throwing around legal threats like confetti. I let her talk until she ran out of steam, then calmly reminded her. You built your pipeline through my ranch. The source belongs to me now. I don't owe you a drop. News of the shutdown spread like wildfire. A local reporter caught wind of the story, and suddenly cameras were pointed at their front gate. The HOA board tried to spin the narrative, claiming they were victims of an unreasonable landowner. But the truth leaked out fast. People learned they had never secured water rights in the first place. Meanwhile, I carried on with my life at the ranch. My cattle troughs were full, my pastures watered. I had taken back what they stole, and I didn't have to lift another finger. Their carefully built illusion of control was collapsing, and I simply watched it happen from my porch with quiet satisfaction. By the fourth day, the HOA's panic had turned into desperation. Their board members, once smug and untouchable, now wore exhaustion on their faces. They tried trucking in water, but that only scratched the surface of what hundreds of homes required. Homeowners were growing furious, not just at the dry taps but at the realization that their board had gambled everything without securing the basics. Meetings grew heated. Yelling spilled out onto the sidewalks. A few residents even marched up to the HOA office with signs demanding accountability. Their perfect neighborhood was unraveling from the inside. That afternoon, a convoy of black SUVs rolled up my ranch's long dirt road. Out stepped the HOA president and two board members, wearing expensive shoes that clearly weren't made for dust and mud. Their smiles were forced, their tone carefully measured, like people who'd realized their power wasn't real anymore. "We'd like to talk," the president said through clenched teeth. I offered them no coffee, no hospitality, just the truth. They tried their usual tactics first, pretending to be reasonable, hinting at legal threats, appealing to community well-being. But they didn't have leverage anymore. I laid out my terms clearly. They would buy official easement rights at my price, compensate me for the damages they caused, pay my legal fees, and agree in writing that I controlled the water source. Not a single drop would flow until everything was signed and notarized. For a long moment, they sat there in silence, the weight of their mistakes settling in. Finally, the president exhaled sharply. "We don't have a choice, do we?" she muttered. I simply leaned back and said, "No, you don't." They signed the agreement that evening. The same people who had bulldozed through my land now came to me like tenants asking permission. It was exactly the turn I'd been waiting for. In the weeks that followed, the once defiant HOA transformed into a humbled, cooperative entity. The pipeline still ran beneath my southern pasture, but it no longer belonged to them. It worked on my terms. Each month, their board wired a hefty payment to my account for the legal easement and access to the water. What had started as their bold act of entitlement had become a steady source of income for me. My lawyer made sure every clause was airtight. Any violation, any attempt to bypass my control, and the valve would be turned off again, permanently. They knew it, and they didn't dare test me. Their community changed too. Gone were the extravagant fountains and wasteful sprinklers. The HOA sent out water conservation guidelines to residents, suddenly preaching the value of the very resource they once took for granted. Their lawns grew duller, their habits shifted, and the board that once acted like royalty was now under constant scrutiny from its own homeowners. Several members resigned in disgrace after the truth of their reckless decisions spread. A new board took over, one that spoke carefully and, more importantly, listened. For me, the ranch returned to its peaceful rhythm. The morning silence was back, broken only by the sound of cattle and wind over the fields. But now, I carried something more than satisfaction. I carried the knowledge that I'd turned their arrogance into my advantage. What they built without permission became a permanent reminder of who truly held the power. Sometimes, I'd walk up to the spring just to listen to the steady rush of water and smile. They thought they could build their future on my land. Instead, I owned theirs. In the end, I didn't just win a fight over a pipeline. I reminded them what happens when you take without asking.